2 miles beneath the Atlantic Ocean lies America's most haunting maritime mystery. The USS Thresher was supposed to be unsinkable, the pinnacle of nuclear submarine technology, built to dive deeper and fight harder than any vessel before it. Instead, on April 10th, 1963, it became a tomb for 129 souls, who simply vanished without explanation. For 60 years, the official story blamed a catastrophic flooding incident during routine deep diving trials. But newly declassified documents and unprecedented access to the wreckage tell a very different tale. What really happened in those final moments when the Thresher's crew sent their last garbled transmission to the surface? Why did the Navy immediately classify every detail of the disaster under Cold War secrecy protocols? What was the Thresher really doing that day? And why does the truth still matter 6 decades later? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The blueprint, spread across Admiral Hyman Rickover's desk, told a story of American ambition written in steel and atomic fire. Every line, every specification, every carefully calculated measurement represented years of engineering genius poured into creating the world's most advanced submarine. The USS Thresher wasn't just another vessel in the Navy's fleet. It was a declaration of technological supremacy that would reshape underwater warfare forever. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard hummed with purpose on that crisp New England morning in 1958 as construction began on hull number SSN 593. The workers who arrived at dawn knew they were building something special, though few understood the full scope of what they were creating. The Thresher would be the first of a new class of attack submarines, designed to dive deeper, move faster, and strike with more precision than any underwater vessel in history. The specifications were staggering. While conventional submarines of the era could safely dive to perhaps 400 feet, the Thresher was engineered to reach depths of 1,300 feet deeper than any operational submarine had ever gone. Her nuclear reactor would push her through the ocean depths at speeds approaching 30 knots submerged, making her faster underwater than most surface ships could manage on a calm sea. But it was the weapons systems that truly set her apart. The Thresher carried a new generation of torpedoes, capable of tracking and destroying enemy submarines at ranges previously thought impossible. Her sonar systems could detect hostile vessels from distances measured in miles rather than hundreds of yards. In the underwater chess game of Cold War naval strategy, the Thresher represented America's boldest gambit. Captain Dean Axine watched the construction progress with the satisfaction of a man who knew he would soon command the most sophisticated warship ever built. Selected personally by Admiral Rickover, Axine had spent 2 years studying every system, every component, every possible failure mode that might affect his future command. The nuclear navy demanded perfection from its officers, and the Thresher would accept nothing less. The crew selection process reflected the submarine's elite status. From across the Navy's submarine force came the brightest engineers, the most skilled technicians, the most experienced sonar operators. Each man underwent months of specialized training on systems that existed nowhere else in the world. They learned to operate machinery so advanced that it would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. Chief Petty Officer Raymond McCool had served on submarines throughout World War II, surviving depth charge attacks in the Pacific that claimed many of his shipmates. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for the complexity of the Thresher's nuclear propulsion plant. The reactor compartment contained technology that harnessed the same forces that powered the sun, all contained within a steel pressure vessel designed to withstand the crushing depths of the ocean's deepest trenches. The construction timeline pushed every limit of industrial capability. Portsmouth Naval Shipyard had never attempted anything so ambitious, and the pressure to complete the project on schedule came directly from the highest levels of government. The Soviet Union was expanding its submarine fleet at an alarming rate, and American naval supremacy hung in the balance. Work continued around the clock, with welders and technicians laboring under floodlights to meet impossible deadlines. The hull took shape gradually, each section carefully inspected and tested before joining with the next. Quality control inspectors checked and double-checked every weld, every fitting, every component that would keep 129 men alive in the ocean's most hostile environment. But beneath the surface of this technological triumph, subtle problems were emerging. The revolutionary deep diving design required manufacturing tolerances more precise than anything previously attempted in submarine construction. Components that worked perfectly in laboratory conditions sometimes behaved unpredictably when subjected to the crushing pressures of the deep ocean. Lieutenant Commander John Harvey, the submarine's engineering officer, noted several anomalies during systems testing that troubled him. Pressure readings that fluctuated unexpectedly, valve responses that seemed sluggish under certain conditions, small discrepancies that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested that the Thresher's systems were operating at the very edge of their design limits. The launch ceremony on the 9th of July, 1960, drew dignitaries from across the Navy's leadership. As the massive submarine slid into Portsmouth Harbour's dark waters, cheers erupted from the thousands of workers who had devoted 3 years of their lives to this moment. The Thresher represented the pinnacle of American engineering achievement, a fusion of atomic power and naval tradition that would carry democracy's hopes into the ocean's darkest depths. Admiral Rickover himself spoke at the commissioning ceremony 18 months later, his words carrying the weight of personal conviction. The nuclear navy he had created from nothing now possessed a weapon that could project American power to any ocean on Earth. The Thresher and her sister ships would ensure that no enemy submarine could threaten American interests without facing swift and decisive retaliation. Yet, even as the celebrations continued, a small group of engineers quietly discussed concerns that had emerged during the submarine's final testing phases. The Thresher's revolutionary design pushed every system to its absolute limits, leaving little margin for error in the unforgiving environment of deep ocean operations. The leather-bound logbook lay open on Captain Harvey's desk as the first hints of dawn crept through the porthole of his stateroom. His final entry, written in the precise handwriting that had become his trademark throughout 20 years of naval service, reflected both routine confidence and the subtle weight of command responsibility that never truly left a submarine captain's shoulders. The 10th of April 1963, 0530 hours. Weather conditions favorable for deep diving trials. Sea state 2 to 3, winds from southwest at 15 knots. All systems nominal following post-overhaul inspections. Crew morale, excellent. Proceeding to diving area as scheduled. Captain John Wesley Harvey closed the logbook and secured it in his desk drawer, unaware that those would be the last words he would ever write. At 43, Harvey had commanded submarines through some of the Navy's most challenging operations, earning a reputation for both technical expertise and careful judgment. The Thresher represented the pinnacle of his career, command of the most advanced submarine ever built. The pre-dawn hours aboard the Thresher hummed with the quiet efficiency that marked a well-trained crew preparing for a complex operation. In the engine room, Chief Petty Officer Raymond McCool conducted his final inspection of the nuclear reactor systems, checking pressure readings and coolant flow rates with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 2 decades of submarine service. The reactor had performed flawlessly during the Thresher's 9-month overhaul at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. New components had been installed, systems upgraded, and every critical component tested to ensure peak performance. Yet McCool harbored the subtle unease that came from working with technology pushed to its absolute limits. The Thresher's reactor operated at higher pressures and temperatures than any previous submarine design, leaving little margin for error. In the torpedo room, Torpedoman First Class Ronald Babcock supervised the loading of the final test equipment. Today's dive would push the Thresher to depths no American submarine had ever attempted operationally. The crushing pressure at 1,300 feet would test every seal, every fitting, every carefully welded joint in the submarine's revolutionary hull design. Babcock had served aboard 4 different submarines during his Navy career, but nothing had prepared him for the Thresher's complexity. The submarine carried weapon systems so advanced that their full capabilities remained classified even from most of the crew. Today's trials would prove whether American engineering could truly master the ocean's most hostile environment. The galley filled with the familiar aromas of coffee and bacon as Cook First Class Robert Garner prepared breakfast for 129 men who would soon descend into the ocean's depths. Garner took pride in maintaining crew morale through quality meals, understanding that good food became even more important during the stress of demanding operations. Many of the crew members had written letters home the previous evening, following the time-honored tradition of submariners facing dangerous operations. These letters, stored safely in the submarine's communication center, carried messages of love and reassurance to families who understood the risks their men faced but never spoke of them directly. Lieutenant Commander Pat Garner, the submarine's executive officer, conducted the final briefing with his department heads in the wardroom. The diving plan called for a gradual descent to maximum operational depth, followed by a series of tests designed to verify the Thresher's capabilities after her extensive overhaul. Every system had been checked and double-checked. Emergency procedures had been reviewed until every crew member could execute them instinctively. The Thresher's safety systems represented the most advanced engineering available, designed to protect the crew even in the event of catastrophic failure. Yet, submarine operations always carried inherent risks that no amount of preparation could entirely eliminate. At depths approaching 1,300 feet, the ocean's pressure exceeded 580 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a human body instantly and turn the strongest steel into twisted wreckage. If the submarine's pressure hull failed, the crew understood these risks without dwelling on them. They had trained for years to operate in an environment that would kill them in seconds if their technology failed. Their confidence came from rigorous preparation, superior equipment, and absolute faith in their fellow crew members. As the Thresher prepared to get underway, families across New England were awakening to what they expected would be another routine day. Wives prepared breakfast for children who would head off to school, carrying lunchboxes and homework assignments. Nobody imagined that 129 husbands, fathers, and sons were about to embark on a journey from which they would never return. The morning sun painted Portsmouth Harbor in shades of gold and crimson as the Thresher's lines were cast off. Her nuclear reactor hummed with barely contained power as she moved slowly toward the open ocean, where the deepest waters of the Atlantic awaited. Behind her, the familiar landmarks of coastal New Hampshire gradually faded into morning haze. Captain Harvey stood on the submarine's bridge, breathing the fresh sea air one final time before ordering the dive that would take his crew into the ocean's darkest depths. The weather remained favorable, the sea calm, and every system aboard his submarine functioned perfectly. Nothing in the peaceful morning suggested the tragedy that lay just hours ahead. Lieutenant Commander Stanley Hecker aboard the USS Skylark methodically recorded each entry in the navigation log as the Thresher began her descent into the Atlantic's depths. The precise coordinates, 41 degree, 46 north, 64 degrees, 57 west, marked a position 220 miles east of Cape Cod, where the ocean floor plunged to depths exceeding 8,000 feet. Here, in waters so deep that sunlight had never touched the bottom, the Navy's most advanced submarine would attempt to prove her revolutionary design. 0800 hours. Thresher reports diving to 400 feet. Hecker wrote in his careful script. All systems nominal. Communication clear on underwater telephone. The underwater telephone system allowed voice communication between the submerged Thresher and her surface escort, though the quality degraded significantly as depth increased. Captain Harvey's voice came through clearly at first, professional and confident, as he reported the submarine's progress through her initial descent. Skylark, this is Thresher. Passing 200 feet, all conditions normal. Proceeding to 400 feet as planned. The Thresher's ballast tanks had flooded smoothly, allowing the massive submarine to slip beneath the surface with the grace that had become her trademark. Her crew worked with practiced efficiency at their stations, monitoring instruments and adjusting systems as the crushing pressure of the deep ocean began to assert its dominance. In the submarine's control room, Diving Officer Lieutenant Commander Michael Dinola watched the depth gauge climb steadily downward. The Thresher had performed this routine countless times during her operational career, but today's dive would push her deeper than any previous test. The submarine's revolutionary hull design had been calculated to withstand pressures that would crush conventional vessels like empty tin cans. 0830 hours. Thresher reports 600 feet, continuing descent. The Skylark's log recorded. Voice communication becoming intermittent due to depth. The ocean around the Thresher darkened from blue to black as she descended beyond the reach of natural light. Bioluminescent creatures occasionally flickered past her periscope like falling stars, the only signs of life in this alien environment. The submarine's sonar painted a three-dimensional picture of the surrounding water, revealing the empty vastness that stretched in all directions. Chief Sonoman Paul McCallum hunched over his instruments, listening to the subtle sounds that revealed the ocean's secrets. The Thresher's advanced sonar could detect targets at unprecedented ranges, but at extreme depth, the crushing pressure affected even the most sophisticated equipment in ways that designers had never fully anticipated. 0900 hours. Thresher reports approaching 1,000 feet. Hecker continued his methodical record-keeping. Communication quality deteriorating. Last clear transmission reported all systems functioning normally. The pressure hull around the submarine's crew began to emit the subtle groaning sounds that accompanied deep diving. Steel compressed under enormous pressure, joints stressed to their design limits, and countless components worked harder than their manufacturers had ever intended. The Thresher's revolutionary design pushed every system to the very edge of what was possible with 1,960 seconds technology. Lieutenant Commander John Smars monitored the ballast blow system that would bring the Thresher back to the surface when the test concluded. High-pressure air stored in massive tanks would force water from the ballast tanks, providing the buoyancy needed to overcome the submarine's weight. The system had been tested countless times, proven reliable through years of operation. 0915 hours. Thresher reports 1,200 feet. Communication extremely poor, receiving only fragments of transmissions. Captain Harvey's voice, when it could be understood through the static and distortion, remained calm and professional. The submarine continued her descent toward the maximum depth that would prove her capabilities to skeptical Navy officials. Every foot deeper demonstrated American technological superiority in the underwater realm where future wars might be fought. In the engine room, the nuclear reactor continued its controlled fission reaction, providing power for life support, propulsion, and the countless systems that kept 129 men alive in an environment that would kill them instantly if their technology failed. The reactor had performed flawlessly throughout the submarine's career, but operating at extreme depth placed unprecedented demands on every component. 0930 hours. Thresher approaching maximum test depth. Last intelligible transmission reported minor difficulties with angle and depth control. The Skylark's crew strained to understand the increasingly garbled transmissions from their sister ship. Standard procedure called for the submarine to level off at maximum depth, conduct a series of tests, then begin her ascent to the surface. The entire evolution should take no more than 2 hours from start to finish. Chief Radioman John Wise adjusted his equipment repeatedly, trying to improve communication with the Thresher as she descended into the ocean's darkest depths. The submarine's powerful transmitters were fighting against increasing water pressure and distance, their signals growing weaker with each passing minute. 094. 5 hours. Communication with Thresher becoming unintelligible. Last transmission appeared to report some form of emergency procedures in progress. Far below the Skylark's hull, the Thresher continued her descent into a realm where human engineering would face its ultimate test against the raw power of the deep ocean. The official Navy casualty report, stamped with red classification markings and dated the 10th of April 1963, documented the exact moment when routine submarine operations transformed into America's worst peacetime naval disaster. At 0917 hours Eastern Standard Time, the USS Thresher simply vanished from the world above the waves, taking 129 souls into the Atlantic's crushing depths. Lieutenant Commander Stanley Hecker stared at his underwater telephone equipment in growing disbelief. For the past 20 minutes, communication with the Thresher had deteriorated steadily, but submarines often experience technical difficulties during deep diving operations. The crushing pressure at extreme depths affected even the most sophisticated equipment in unpredictable ways. Thresher, this is Skylark. Please respond. Hecker transmitted for the 15th time in 5 minutes. The underwater telephone speakers crackled with static, but no human voice emerged from the electronic noise. Captain James Bella joined Hecker at the communication station, his weathered face reflecting the concern that was spreading through the Skylark's crew. As escort vessel commander, Bella bore responsibility for monitoring the Thresher's safety during her deep diving trials. The submarine should have reached maximum depth by now and begun her ascent back to safer waters. How long since the last transmission? Bella asked. 12 minutes, sir. The last thing we heard sounded like emergency blow procedures, but the signal was so distorted I can't be certain. Emergency blow procedures represented a submarine's most desperate attempt to reach the surface quickly. High-pressure air would force water from the ballast tanks, providing maximum buoyancy to overcome the submarine's weight. If the Thresher was conducting emergency blow procedures, something had gone seriously wrong during her dive. The Skylark's sonar operator, Petty Officer Robert Summers, hunched over his instruments, listening for any sound that might indicate the Thresher's location. Sonar could detect submarines at considerable distances, but the ocean's thermal layers and ambient noise made tracking extremely difficult. At depths approaching 1,300 feet, even the most sophisticated sonar systems operated at the limits of their capabilities. Contact bearing 090, range approximately 2,000 yards, Summers reported suddenly. Sounds like compressed air escaping underwater. Captain Bella rushed to the sonar station, pressing headphones to his ears to hear what his operator had detected. The sound was unmistakable, massive quantities of high-pressure air bubbling to the surface from somewhere far below. If the Thresher was conducting emergency blow procedures, this would be exactly what they would expect to hear. But the sound continued far longer than any emergency blow should take. A submarine's ballast tanks contained finite amounts of air, and even maximum emergency procedures should complete within minutes. The bubbling sounds from below continued for nearly 20 minutes, suggesting something far more catastrophic than routine emergency procedures. "All stop," Captain Bella ordered. "Maintain position and continue monitoring all frequencies." The Skylark's engines fell silent as the escort vessel held position over the diving area. Her crew strained their senses for any indication that the Thresher was fighting her way back to the surface. Emergency procedures called for the submarine to communicate her status immediately upon reaching the surface. But the ocean remained ominously quiet. Chief radioman William Schaefer tried every communication frequency available, broadcasting on emergency channels that the Thresher should monitor even during catastrophic failures. The powerful transmitters aboard the Skylark could reach submarines hundreds of miles away, but they received no response from the vessel that should have been directly below them. Skylark to Naval Communications Station Portsmouth. Schaefer transmitted on the encrypted command frequency. Emergency. Lost communication with USS Thresher during deep diving operations. Request immediate assistance. The response from Portsmouth came within minutes, carrying the urgency that accompanied potential submarine disasters. Skylark, this is Portsmouth. Clarify status of Thresher. When was last communication received? Last intelligible transmission at 0917 hours. Submarine was approaching maximum test depth. Possible emergency blow procedures detected on sonar, but no communication since. Admiral Frank Andrews at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard received the emergency notification while reviewing construction schedules for the Thresher's sister ships. As the officer responsible for the nuclear submarine program, Andrews understood immediately that the loss of communication during deep diving operations represented every submariner's worst nightmare. Initiate Operation Recovery immediately, Andrews ordered. Deploy all available search and rescue assets to the Thresher's last known position. Notify Commander Submarine Force Atlantic and the Chief of Naval Operations. Within hours, the Navy's most sophisticated search and rescue equipment would converge on the coordinates where the Thresher had vanished. Deep-sea rescue vessels, specialized diving equipment, and underwater detection systems would begin the desperate search for any sign of the missing submarine. But as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the ocean remained silent. No emergency buoy had surfaced from the Thresher's emergency equipment. No radio signals indicated crew members fighting for survival in damaged compartments. The Atlantic had swallowed the Navy's most advanced submarine as completely as if she had never existed. The official casualty report would eventually document every detail of the search that followed, but it could never capture the human anguish of families waiting for news that would never come. In houses across New England, wives prepared dinner for husbands who would never return home, while children completed homework assignments that their fathers would never see. The Bathyscaphe Trieste's dive log, written in the steady hand of Lieutenant Commander Don Keach, recorded humanity's first descent to the Thresher's final resting place. The 24th of August, 1963, 0630 hours. Commencing dive to locate USS Thresher wreckage. Estimated depth 8,400 feet. Weather conditions optimal for deep-sea operations. 4 months had passed since the submarine's disappearance, and the most extensive search operation in naval history had finally located debris scattered across the ocean floor. The Trieste, the same deep-diving vessel that had carried humans to the deepest point on Earth just 3 years earlier, now descended toward a graveyard that would rewrite everything the Navy thought it knew about submarine safety. Within hours of the Thresher's disappearance, every available search asset on the East Coast had converged on the coordinates where she vanished. The destroyer USS Warrington arrived first, her sonar operators scanning the depths for any trace of the missing submarine. Behind her came a growing flotilla of rescue vessels, each carrying specialized equipment designed for submarine disasters. The search pattern covered hundreds of square miles of ocean, expanding outward from the Thresher's last known position. Surface vessels dragged sensitive hydrophones through the water, listening for the metallic tapping sounds that trapped submariners traditionally used to signal their location. Aircraft equipped with magnetic anomaly detectors flew endless grids overhead, seeking the massive iron signature that a sunken submarine would create. Commander Dean Axine, the Thresher's former captain, who had been transferred to another assignment just weeks before the disaster, flew aboard one of the search aircraft. He knew every inch of his former command, every compartment where crew members might survive in air pockets if the submarine had somehow reached the bottom intact. Any metallic contact could be significant, Axine briefed the search crews. The Thresher carries emergency breathing apparatus that could keep men alive for several days if they're trapped in sealed compartments. We cannot assume total loss until we've explored every possibility. The submarine rescue vessel, USS Skylark, remained on station above the dive site, her crew maintaining continuous sonar watch. Captain James Bella had not left his post since the Thresher's disappearance, driven by the desperate hope that his underwater telephone might suddenly crackle to life with voices from below. Deep-sea rescue equipment that existed nowhere else in the world was rushed to the search area. The rescue chamber, DSRV-1, capable of mating with a disabled submarine's escape hatches, was lowered repeatedly into the depths. Each dive carried the possibility of finding survivors clinging to life in the Thresher's compartments. But as hours turned to days, hope began to fade among the searchers. The ocean at 8,400 feet was a realm of perpetual darkness and crushing pressure that would instantly kill any human exposed to its environment. If the Thresher had indeed reached those depths, her crew would have died within seconds of the submarine's pressure hull failing. The breakthrough came when the research vessel USNS Mizar detected debris on the ocean floor using newly developed deep-sea photography equipment. Grainy images transmitted from the depths showed twisted metal fragments scattered across the abyssal plain. The pieces were too small and too badly damaged to identify with certainty, but their location matched the Thresher's projected path to the bottom. Admiral Frank Andrews studied the photographs in the Mizar's cramped laboratory, his weathered face reflecting the grim reality that was becoming undeniable. The debris pattern suggested catastrophic structural failure, the kind of damage that would occur if a submarine's pressure hull collapsed under the enormous pressure of the deep ocean. "We need eyes on the wreckage," Andrews decided. The Trieste is the only vessel capable of reaching those depths and providing detailed visual confirmation. The Trieste represented the cutting edge of deep-sea exploration technology. Her steel pressure sphere could protect human occupants at depths that would crush conventional submarines, while her powerful lights and cameras could document what they found in the ocean's darkest depths. Dr. Robert Dietz, the Navy's leading oceanographer, would accompany the dive to provide scientific analysis of the wreckage. His expertise in deep-sea geology and submarine design made him uniquely qualified to interpret whatever they discovered on the bottom. The descent took over 4 hours, the Trieste sinking slowly through layers of increasingly cold and dark water. At 6,000 feet, the last traces of sunlight disappeared completely, leaving only the submersible's artificial lights to illuminate the alien world of the deep ocean. At 8,400 feet, the lights revealed a scene that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. Scattered across the muddy ocean floor lay the broken remains of what had once been the Navy's most advanced submarine. The Thresher had been torn apart by forces beyond human comprehension, her revolutionary design no match for the raw power of the deep ocean. Pieces of the submarine lay scattered over an area larger than several football fields. The massive pressure hull had split like an eggshell, its steel plating twisted into shapes that spoke of unimaginable violence. Equipment and personal belongings were mixed with debris, creating a mechanical graveyard that marked the final resting place of 129 brave men. The declassified NSA memorandum, stamped with multiple security classifications and dated the 11th of April 1963, revealed the immediate concern that the Thresher disaster had created within America's intelligence community. Flash priority. Soviet naval intelligence activity increased 300% in North Atlantic region following USS Thresher incident. Recommend immediate classification of all operational details. Within hours of the submarine's disappearance, Soviet trawlers began appearing in unusual numbers along the eastern seaboard. These vessels, ostensibly engaged in commercial fishing operations, carried sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment designed to intercept American naval communications. The loss of the Thresher represented an intelligence opportunity that the Soviet Union would not allow to pass unexploited. Admiral George Anderson, Chief of Naval Operations, convened an emergency meeting in the Pentagon's most secure conference room. The men, who gathered around the polished oak table, represented the highest levels of American naval leadership, each bearing responsibility for protecting secrets that could determine the outcome of the Cold War. Gentlemen, we face a crisis that extends far beyond the tragic loss of 129 brave men, Anderson began. The Thresher carried classified technology that represents years of American research and development. We cannot allow that technology to fall into Soviet hands. The submarine's revolutionary design incorporated advances in nuclear reactor technology, sonar systems, and weapons that gave American submarines decisive advantages over their Soviet counterparts. If Soviet salvage operations could recover significant portions of the wreckage, they might gain access to secrets that would neutralize America's underwater superiority. Captain William Thompson from Naval Intelligence outlined the immediate security concerns. Soviet submarine activity in the North Atlantic has tripled since yesterday. We're tracking at least 6 vessels that appear to be conducting systematic searches of the area where Thresher was lost. The intelligence implications were staggering. Soviet engineers had spent years trying to match American submarine technology, particularly the advanced reactor designs that allowed unprecedented underwater endurance. The Thresher's wreckage represented a treasure trove of classified information scattered across the ocean floor. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara joined the meeting via secure telephone from his office across the Potomac. His voice carried the weight of political decisions that would affect America's national security for decades to come. "What are our options for denying the Soviets access to the wreckage?" McNamara asked. Admiral Anderson consulted classified depth charts of the disaster area. The wreckage lies at 8,400 feet, beyond the capability of current Soviet salvage technology. However, their deep-sea research programs are advancing rapidly. We estimate they could develop recovery capability within 2 to 3 years. The meeting participants understood that time was their most precious asset. American salvage technology was more advanced than Soviet capabilities, but both nations were investing heavily in deep-sea recovery systems. The Thresher's secrets would not remain protected by depth alone. Dr. John Craven from the Navy's Special Projects Office presented options for permanent denial of the wreckage site. We could destroy the most sensitive components using explosive charges deployed from surface vessels. Alternatively, we could bury the wreckage under sediment using deep-sea mining equipment. Both options carried significant risks. Explosive charges might scatter classified debris over a wider area, while burial operations would require months of vulnerable surface operations that Soviet surveillance could easily detect. CIA Director John McCone briefed the group on Soviet intelligence activities related to the disaster. Moscow has assigned their top naval engineers to analyze whatever information they can gather about the Thresher incident. They're particularly interested in our reactor technology and advanced sonar systems. The political ramifications extended beyond purely military concerns. Congressional leaders were demanding full disclosure of the circumstances surrounding the disaster, while families of the lost crew members sought answers about their loved ones' final moments. Balancing legitimate demands for information against national security requirements would require careful management. Admiral Hyman Rickover, father of the nuclear navy, argued forcefully for immediate classification of all technical details. The Thresher represented the pinnacle of American submarine design. Every specification, every operating parameter, every lesson learned from this tragedy must remain classified to protect our remaining submarines. The decision to impose total secrecy came from the highest levels of government. President John F. Kennedy himself authorized the classification orders that would hide crucial details of the disaster for decades. The official investigation would proceed under strict security protocols, with findings shared only among personnel with appropriate clearances. Military families bore the greatest burden of this imposed secrecy. Wives and children of the lost crew members were denied detailed explanations of how their husbands and fathers had died. Official statements spoke vaguely of equipment failures and flooding, without revealing the true extent of the technological problems that had claimed the submarine. The cover-up began immediately, with press releases carefully crafted to reveal minimum information while deflecting questions that might compromise classified programs. Reporters were told that the investigation was ongoing, and that full disclosure would have to wait for the completion of official proceedings. Behind the scenes, a different kind of investigation was beginning. Intelligence analysts worked to determine whether the Thresher disaster might have resulted from enemy action rather than mechanical failure. The possibility that Soviet agents had sabotaged America's most advanced submarine could not be dismissed without thorough investigation. The web of secrecy that surrounded the Thresher's loss would shape American submarine operations for generations, creating precedents for classified investigations that prioritized national security over public accountability. The Navy Court of Inquiry's final report, a 1,400-page document with entire sections blacked out by censors, reached its official conclusion on the 15th of October, 1963. The court finds that USS Thresher was lost due to flooding in the engine room caused by a piping system failure. The submarine sank rapidly, exceeding her crush depth before emergency ballast blow procedures could be completed. Admiral Bernard Austin presided over the investigation with the methodical precision that had marked his 30-year naval career. The court consisted of senior submarine officers, nuclear engineers, and technical experts who understood the complex systems that had failed catastrophically on April 10th. Their mandate was to determine not just what had happened, but why it had happened and how similar disasters could be prevented. The investigation began with testimony from the Skylark's crew, the only witnesses to the Thresher's final moments. Lieutenant Commander Stanley Hecker described the deteriorating communications and the sounds of emergency blow procedures that had echoed from the depths. His precise recollection of timing and radio transmissions provided the court with a detailed timeline of the submarine's last minutes. The final transmission was garbled, but it appeared to indicate some form of flooding emergency. Hecker testified, "Standard emergency blow procedures should have brought the submarine to the surface within minutes, but we detected compressed air bubbling to the surface for nearly 20 minutes. Captain James Bella of the Skylark provided technical analysis of the emergency blow sounds that his sonar operators had detected. The prolonged release of high-pressure air suggested that the Thresher's ballast blow system had functioned properly, but that the submarine had continued sinking despite maximum emergency buoyancy. The court examined every aspect of the Thresher's design and construction, focusing particularly on the revolutionary systems that distinguished her from previous submarines. The high-pressure piping that carried superheated steam from the nuclear reactor to the propulsion turbines operated under conditions more extreme than any previous submarine design. Commander William Cowhill, the Navy's leading expert on submarine piping systems, testified about the challenges of maintaining watertight integrity at the pressures required for the Thresher's advanced reactor design. The operating parameters pushed every component to its design limits. A failure in any high-pressure system could cause catastrophic flooding within seconds. The investigation revealed troubling patterns in the Thresher's construction and overhaul history. Quality control inspectors had identified numerous welding defects during the submarine's recent 9-month refurbishment at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Many of these defects had been repaired, but the court discovered that some welds had been approved despite not meeting Navy specifications. Master Chief Petty Officer Frank DeStefan, who had supervised welding operations during the Thresher's construction, admitted under questioning that production pressures had sometimes compromised quality control procedures. "We were under tremendous pressure to complete the work on schedule. Sometimes corners were cut that shouldn't have been cut." The court's technical analysis focused on a specific section of piping in the engine room where silver brazed joints had been used instead of welded connections. These joints, while adequate for normal operations, were potentially vulnerable to failure under the extreme conditions of deep diving operations. Dr. James Wakelin from the Navy's Applied Science Laboratory presented metallurgical analysis of similar piping systems from the Thresher's sister ships. His findings suggested that silver braze joints could fail catastrophically when subjected to thermal shock combined with high pressure and vibration. The joint failures would be sudden and complete, Wakelin testified. A single failed connection could flood a compartment within minutes, faster than damage control procedures could respond. The court reconstructed the probable sequence of events that led to the Thresher's loss. A piping failure in the engine room had caused massive flooding that overwhelmed the submarine's drainage systems. The weight of flooding water had increased the submarine's negative buoyancy beyond the capability of her ballast blow system to overcome. Commander Ralph Cousins, an expert in submarine damage control, explained how flooding could cascade through interconnected systems. Once flooding begins in a critical area, it can quickly spread to adjacent compartments through cable runs, ventilation ducts, and equipment passages. The crew would have minutes at most to respond. The investigation also examined the Thresher's crew training and emergency procedures. Captain Harvey and his men had trained extensively for flooding emergencies, but the speed and severity of the actual emergency had exceeded their ability to respond effectively. The court's findings led to immediate changes in submarine construction standards. New regulations required more rigorous testing of high-pressure systems, improved welding standards, and enhanced emergency blow capabilities that could overcome flooding in multiple compartments. However, significant portions of the investigation remained classified, hidden behind national security requirements that prevented full disclosure of the submarine's capabilities and vulnerabilities. Families of the lost crew members received sanitized summaries that revealed little about the true causes of the disaster. The official conclusion satisfied few of the technical experts who had participated in the investigation. Several court members filed minority opinions, suggesting that the flooding explanation, while plausible, did not account for all the physical evidence recovered from the wreckage site. The handwritten letter, penned on simple stationery with a trembling hand, arrived at the Pentagon on the 18th of November 1963. Dear Secretary McNamara, my husband, Chief Petty Officer Raymond McCool, died aboard the USS Thresher, and I have received nothing but form letters and official silence about how he spent his final moments. I am not asking for military secrets. I am asking for the truth about what happened to the father of my 3 children. Barbara McCool had waited 8 months for answers that never came. The Navy's official notifications spoke in bureaucratic language about equipment failures and flooding, but provided no details about her husband's final minutes or whether he had suffered. The widow of 22 years deserved more than carefully crafted press releases that revealed nothing about the human cost of the disaster. Across New England, 129 families struggled with similar questions that official investigations refused to answer. The wives, children, parents, and siblings of the Thresher's crew found themselves trapped between grief and uncertainty, denied the closure that comes from understanding how their loved ones died. Eleanor Harvey, widow of Captain John Harvey, organized meetings among the families to share information and coordinate their efforts to obtain truthful answers. Her husband had commanded submarines for 2 decades, and she understood that naval operations carried inherent risks. But she also knew that her husband deserved more than sanitized explanations that protected institutional reputations while ignoring human suffering. They tell us that John died serving his country, and we accept that, Eleanor told the gathered families. But they won't tell us whether he suffered, whether the crew had time to understand what was happening, whether they fought to save themselves. We're not asking for classified information. We're asking for basic human dignity. The families hired attorney Joseph Coakley, a Boston lawyer with experience in maritime law and military affairs. Coakley understood that challenging the Navy's classification of the investigation would require persistence and political pressure from outside the military establishment. The government has legitimate national security interests, Coakley explained to his clients. But those interests cannot justify denying families basic information about their loved ones' deaths. We will pursue every legal avenue to obtain the truth. The legal battle began with Freedom of Information Act requests for non-classified portions of the investigation. The Navy responded with heavily redacted documents that revealed almost nothing beyond what had already been disclosed publicly. Entire pages were blacked out, leaving families with fragments of information that raised more questions than they answered. Margaret Garner, whose husband had served as the Thresher's cook, received a document describing her husband's duty station aboard the submarine. Everything else in the 20-page report had been classified, including basic details about emergency procedures and crew survival training that had nothing to do with sensitive technology. The family's quest for information coincided with growing public skepticism about government secrecy in the wake of other controversies. Congressional representatives began receiving letters from constituents demanding more transparency about the Thresher investigation. Senator Thomas McIntyre of New Hampshire, whose state had strong connections to the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, where the Thresher was built, called for congressional hearings on the disaster. His office received hundreds of letters from families and shipyard workers who suspected that the official explanation concealed more serious problems with submarine construction and safety procedures. The families of these brave men deserve honest answers, McIntyre declared on the Senate floor. We cannot allow national security classifications to become a shield for institutional incompetence or negligence. The Navy's response was swift and uncompromising. Admiral Hyman Rickover personally briefed congressional leaders on the classified aspects of the investigation, emphasizing that public disclosure could compromise the safety of other submarines and reveal capabilities to potential enemies. Behind closed doors, Rickover argued that any detailed discussion of the Thresher systems could provide the Soviet Union with information about American submarine vulnerabilities. The nuclear navy's continued effectiveness depended on maintaining absolute secrecy about operational procedures and technical specifications. The families found themselves caught between their need for closure and their government's claims of national security necessity. Some accepted the official explanations and attempted to move forward with their lives, while others continued fighting for information they believed they deserved. Dorothy Schaefer, whose husband had been the Thresher's chief radioman, wrote letters to every member of Congress, the President, and the Secretary of Defense. Her correspondence revealed the emotional toll that official secrecy imposed on military families who had already sacrificed so much for their country. My husband died serving his nation, and I am proud of his service, she wrote. But I cannot understand why his death must be shrouded in mystery that serves no one except bureaucrats who want to avoid accountability for their failures. The family's legal challenges established precedents that would affect military families for decades. Their fight for information highlighted the tension between legitimate security requirements and the human need for truth about loved ones who died in government service. Years would pass before significant portions of the Thresher investigation were declassified, and by then, many of the families had exhausted their resources, fighting for answers that came too late to provide the closure they desperately needed. The salvaged hull fragment, measuring 18 inches by 12 inches and weighing 47 pounds, told a story that contradicted everything the Navy had concluded about the Thresher disaster. Dr. Robert Ballard examined the twisted piece of HY-80 steel under powerful microscopes at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, noting damage patterns that should not have existed if simple flooding had caused the submarine's loss. The fragment had been recovered during a classified salvage operation in 1965, 2 years after the disaster. Deep-sea recovery vehicles had spent months systematically collecting debris from the wreckage site, gathering physical evidence that would either confirm or challenge the official investigation's conclusions. What they found challenged fundamental assumptions about how the Thresher had died. Dr. William Broad, a metallurgist with 30 years of experience analyzing submarine failures, studied the hull fragment's fracture patterns under electron microscopy. The steel showed evidence of explosive decompression rather than gradual flooding, with crystalline structures that formed only under conditions of sudden, catastrophic pressure release. This damage pattern is inconsistent with flooding, Broad explained to a classified review board convened to examine the new evidence. The metal shows signs of instantaneous failure under extreme pressure differential. Something caused the submarine's pressure hull to fail catastrophically, not gradually. The implications were staggering. If the Thresher's hull had failed suddenly rather than flooding slowly, the official explanation of the disaster was fundamentally flawed. The submarine's crew would have died within seconds, with no time for emergency procedures or distress calls. Commander James Bond, a nuclear engineer assigned to analyze the wreckage, discovered additional anomalies in recovered reactor components. Fuel elements showed damage consistent with sudden shutdown under emergency conditions, but control rod positions suggested the reactor had been operating normally when the disaster occurred. The reactor data indicates that the submarine was proceeding normally when whatever happened occurred, Bond reported. There's no evidence of emergency reactor shutdown procedures that would be expected if the crew had time to respond to flooding. The analysis revealed microscopic traces of explosive residue embedded in metal fragments recovered from the wreckage site. Chemical analysis identified compounds consistent with military-grade explosives, though in quantities too small to determine their source or significance. Dr. John Craven, from the Navy's Special Projects Office, supervised additional testing of hull fragments using techniques that had not existed during the original investigation. Advanced spectroscopic analysis revealed metal fatigue patterns that contradicted the official timeline of the disaster. The steel shows evidence of cyclic stress loading that would occur over months or years of operation, Craven testified to the review board. But it also shows sudden fracture patterns that indicate catastrophic failure within seconds or minutes. The review board struggled to reconcile these findings with witness testimony from the Skylark's crew. If the Thresher had suffered catastrophic hull failure, there should have been a massive implosion audible for miles underwater. Yet sonar operators aboard the escort vessel had detected only the sounds of emergency blow procedures. Dr. Ralph Goodwin, an expert in underwater acoustics, proposed that the submarine might have suffered a different type of failure that produced the observed damage patterns while remaining consistent with sonar evidence. His analysis suggested that the Thresher might have experienced a steam explosion in her reactor compartment that compromised hull integrity without causing immediate implosion. A steam explosion would produce the sudden pressure effects we see in the metal fragments, Goodwin explained. It would also explain why the submarine continued to sink despite emergency ballast blow procedures. The crew might have survived the initial explosion, but been unable to control flooding in the damaged reactor compartment. The steam explosion theory gained support from analysis of recovered reactor components. Metallurgists found evidence of superheated steam damage on reactor piping that suggested temperatures far exceeding normal operating parameters. The damage patterns indicated that coolant had flashed to steam almost instantaneously, creating pressures that exceeded the containment system's design limits. However, this explanation raised disturbing questions about reactor safety that extended far beyond the Thresher herself. If a reactor could suffer steam explosions during normal operations, every nuclear submarine in the fleet potentially faced similar risks. Admiral Hyman Rickover personally reviewed the metallurgical evidence, his reputation as father of the nuclear navy hanging on the safety of reactor designs he had personally approved. The possibility that reactor defects had caused the Thresher disaster threatened to undermine public confidence in the entire nuclear submarine program. The evidence is inconclusive, Rickover declared, after examining the hull fragments. Metallurgical analysis can suggest possible failure modes, but it cannot definitively determine the sequence of events that led to the disaster. The review board's final report remained classified for decades, its conclusions hidden from the families who continued seeking answers about their loved ones' deaths. The metallurgical evidence suggested that the official explanation was incomplete at best, but institutional pressures prevented acknowledgement of fundamental errors in the original investigation. Physical evidence from the wreckage continued to contradict official conclusions, but challenging those conclusions would require admitting that the Navy's most experienced investigators had failed to determine the true cause of America's worst peacetime submarine disaster. The anonymous technical report, smuggled out of Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in a brown manila envelope, contained 43 pages of engineering analysis that challenged every official conclusion about the Thresher disaster. Confidential assessment. Systemic design flaws in Thresher-class submarines. Read the cover page. Authored by someone identified only as a concerned engineer. Robert Morrison had worked on submarine construction for 15 years when he made the decision that would end his naval career and potentially save hundreds of lives. As a senior nuclear engineer at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, Morrison possessed intimate knowledge of the design compromises and construction shortcuts that had plagued the Thresher's development from the beginning. The report Morrison compiled in secret detailed specific engineering defects that Navy investigators had either overlooked or deliberately ignored. His analysis focused on the high-pressure air system that provided emergency ballast blow capability, the submarine's last line of defense against flooding emergencies. The emergency blow system contains a fundamental design flaw that renders it ineffective under certain operating conditions, Morrison wrote. Airlines routed through flooded compartments will freeze when high-pressure air expands rapidly, blocking airflow to ballast tanks and preventing emergency surfacing. Morrison's calculations showed that the Thresher's emergency blow system would fail precisely when it was needed most. If flooding occurred in the engine room where major airlines were routed, expanding air would freeze moisture in the lines, creating ice blockages that prevented air from reaching the ballast tanks. The engineer had tried to raise these concerns through official channels during the submarine's construction, but his warnings were dismissed by supervisors under pressure to complete the project on schedule. Morrison's personnel file contained reprimands for excessive attention to minor design details and failure to maintain appropriate production schedules. I was told repeatedly that the design had been thoroughly tested and approved by the highest levels of Navy engineering, Morrison recalled years later. When I persisted in raising safety concerns, I was transferred to less critical projects and warned that my career advancement would suffer if I continued to question approved designs. The anonymous report contained detailed blueprints showing the routing of high-pressure airlines through compartments that would flood rapidly if piping failures occurred. Morrison's analysis demonstrated that the very flooding that emergency blow procedures were designed to overcome would disable the system meant to save the submarine. Commander William Cowhill, who had testified during the official investigation about piping system failures, received a copy of Morrison's report through unofficial channels. Cowhill recognized immediately that the analysis explained why the Thresher had continued sinking despite successful activation of emergency blow procedures. "This changes everything we thought we knew about the disaster," Cowhill told a confidential meeting of submarine safety officers. If Morrison's analysis is correct, the Thresher was doomed from the moment flooding began in her engine room. The report's implications extended far beyond the Thresher herself. Morrison identified similar design flaws in other submarines of the same class, vessels that continued operating with potentially fatal vulnerabilities that Navy leadership refused to acknowledge. Admiral Hyman Rickover learned of Morrison's report through intelligence channels and immediately ordered an investigation into the leak of classified information. Rather than addressing the engineering concerns Morrison had raised, Rickover focused on identifying and punishing the whistleblower who had embarrassed the nuclear navy. "This represents a serious breach of security protocols," Rickover declared at a classified briefing. "The unauthorized disclosure of technical information could provide potential enemies with details about our submarine vulnerabilities." Morrison's identity remained secret for months, protected by sympathetic colleagues who understood that his motives were driven by concern for submarine safety rather than personal gain. However, the Navy's investigation eventually identified Morrison through analysis of typing patterns and paper stock used in the report. The confrontation in Rickover's office was swift and brutal. Morrison was stripped of his security clearance, transferred to a non-sensitive position, and eventually forced to resign from government service. His engineering career effectively ended. Morrison took a job teaching high school mathematics in rural New Hampshire. "They destroyed my career for telling the truth about design flaws that killed 129 men," Morrison said in his only public interview decades later. "I couldn't live with myself knowing that other submarines were operating with the same defects that doomed the Thresher." Morrison's technical analysis was classified and buried in Navy files, its conclusions hidden from congressional investigators and submarine safety boards. The engineering changes needed to correct the design flaws were implemented quietly on newer submarines, but the Navy never acknowledged that Morrison's warnings had been accurate. The cover-up extended to Morrison's personal life, as government investigators examined his finances, questioned his friends, and monitored his communications for years after his dismissal. The message to other potential whistleblowers was clear. Challenging official conclusions about the Thresher disaster would result in professional destruction. Other engineers who had worked on the Thresher's construction remained silent about problems they had observed, unwilling to sacrifice their careers for truth that institutional power was determined to suppress. Morrison's fate served as a warning that loyalty to the institution mattered more than loyalty to facts. The high-resolution sonar mapping data collected by the research vessel Atlantis in 2019 revealed details of the Thresher wreckage that had remained hidden for over 50 years. Advanced multi-beam sonar systems painted a three-dimensional picture of the debris field with precision, measured in centimeters rather than meters, showing the submarine's final resting place as clearly as if floodlights illuminated the ocean floor. Dr. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who had discovered the Titanic 3 decades earlier, led the expedition that would finally provide definitive answers about America's most mysterious submarine disaster. Modern deep-sea technology had advanced far beyond the primitive capabilities available in 1963, offering unprecedented opportunities to examine evidence that earlier investigators could only glimpse through grainy photographs. The sonar data revealed a debris pattern that contradicted fundamental assumptions about how the Thresher had sunk. Instead of a single impact crater that would indicate rapid descent and implosion, the wreckage was scattered across an area exceeding 600 yards in diameter. The submarine had broken apart during its descent, not after reaching the ocean floor. What we're seeing here is inconsistent with the official explanation of catastrophic flooding, Ballard explained to his research team as they studied the sonar images. The debris pattern suggests that the submarine suffered multiple structural failures during her descent, possibly over a period of several minutes. The research vessel's remotely operated vehicles descended to the wreckage site equipped with high-definition cameras and manipulator arms capable of collecting samples for detailed analysis. Unlike the limited capabilities of 1,960 seconds technology, modern ROVs could spend hours on the bottom, systematically documenting every piece of debris with photographic precision. Video footage from the ocean floor revealed sections of the Thresher's hull that showed no evidence of the massive flooding damage that should have been present if the official explanation were accurate. Instead, hull plating showed fracture patterns consistent with explosive decompression, suggesting that the submarine's pressure hull had failed suddenly rather than gradually flooding. Dr. James Cameron, the filmmaker and deep-sea explorer, participated in the expedition using his specialized submersible deep-sea Challenger. His descent to the Thresher wreckage provided human eyes on observation of details that remote vehicles might overlook. The damage patterns are unlike anything I've seen in other deep-sea wrecks, Cameron reported from the bottom. The hull sections show evidence of catastrophic structural failure, but the debris distribution suggests the submarine remained relatively intact until she reached extreme depth. Advanced metallurgical analysis of samples collected by the expedition revealed microscopic details that had been impossible to detect with 1,960 seconds technology. Scanning electron microscopy showed crystal structures in the steel that formed only under specific conditions of temperature and pressure, providing clues about the forces that had destroyed the submarine. Dr. Kristin von Reden from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution conducted isotopic analysis of metal samples that revealed the presence of trace elements inconsistent with normal submarine operations. The analysis detected minute quantities of materials that suggested the involvement of classified experimental systems not mentioned in any official investigation. The expedition also employed advanced computer modeling to reconstruct the Thresher's final descent based on the debris pattern and damage analysis. Supercomputers could now simulate the complex physics of submarine implosion and structural failure with accuracy that previous investigators could never achieve. The computer models suggest that the Thresher suffered initial damage at relatively shallow depth, then continued sinking while progressively breaking apart, explained Dr. Michel Cortez, the expedition's computational physicist. This is fundamentally different from the catastrophic flooding scenario described in official reports. The research team discovered sections of the submarine that had been missed by earlier salvage operations, including portions of the reactor compartment that showed damage patterns inconsistent with steam explosions or flooding. The reactor pressure vessel remained intact, contradicting theories that reactor failure had caused the disaster. Modern forensic techniques applied to debris, recovered decades earlier, revealed evidence that had been overlooked or misinterpreted by earlier investigations. DNA analysis of biological samples confirmed the identity of crew members whose remains had been recovered, providing closure for families who had waited 60 years for definitive answers. The expedition's findings were compiled into a comprehensive report that challenged every major conclusion of the 1,963 investigation. Advanced technology had revealed physical evidence that the original investigators could not have detected, but also evidence that suggested deliberate concealment of critical information. We now possess the technological capability to determine exactly what happened to the Thresher, Ballard concluded. The question is whether institutional interests will allow the truth to be acknowledged after 60 years of official denial. The modern investigation faced the same institutional resistance that had suppressed earlier challenges to official conclusions. Military officials argued that revealing new information about the Thresher disaster could compromise the security of current submarine operations, even though the technology involved was decades obsolete. The advanced sonar mapping and debris analysis provided the most complete picture of the Thresher disaster ever assembled. But translating scientific evidence into official acknowledgement would require overcoming the same bureaucratic obstacles that had protected the original cover-up for 6 decades. The Titanium Component Analysis Report, prepared by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Materials Science Laboratory, documented metal fatigue patterns that rewrote the timeline of the Thresher disaster. Sample TSR-47 exhibits stress fractures inconsistent with catastrophic flooding scenarios. Crystalline structure analysis indicates failure occurred under conditions of rapid pressure cycling rather than sustained external pressure. Dr. Sarah Chen, MIT's leading expert in deep-sea metallurgy, had spent 18 months analyzing titanium components recovered from the Thresher's reactor compartment during the 2019 expedition. Her findings challenged not only the official explanation of the disaster, but fundamental assumptions about how submarines fail under extreme conditions. The titanium samples came from the submarine's main steam system, components that should have remained intact even during catastrophic flooding. Titanium's exceptional strength and corrosion resistance made it ideal for critical submarine systems, but the recovered pieces showed damage that defied conventional engineering understanding. These components failed from the inside out, Chen explained to a panel of naval engineers convened to review her findings. The fracture patterns indicate that internal pressure exceeded the material's yield strength, causing explosive failure that propagated through connected systems. Advanced electron microscopy revealed microscopic details, invisible to 1,960 investigators. The titanium showed evidence of hydrogen embrittlement, a condition that occurs when hydrogen gas penetrates the metal's crystal structure and weakens it from within. This type of damage required specific chemical conditions that should not have existed during normal submarine operations. Dr. Michael Torres, a marine archaeologist who had participated in the wreckage expedition, applied forensic techniques borrowed from criminal investigations to analyze the debris field's spatial distribution. His work revealed that pieces of the submarine's reactor compartment were scattered in a pattern inconsistent with simple implosion or flooding. Archaeological analysis treats each artifact's position as evidence, Torres explained. The reactor component's distribution suggests they were ejected from the submarine during her descent, not compressed inward by external pressure. The research team employed advanced 3D modeling software to reconstruct the Thresher's breakup sequence based on debris locations and damage analysis. The computer simulation revealed that the submarine had suffered multiple structural failures in rapid succession, beginning with her reactor compartment and propagating throughout the vessel. Dr. Lisa Brennan from the Naval Research Laboratory conducted chemical analysis of sediment samples collected from around the wreckage. Her tests detected trace amounts of exotic materials that had no business being present in a routine submarine reactor system. We found isotopic signatures consistent with experimental reactor fuel elements, Brennan reported to a classified review board. These materials were not part of the Thresher's standard reactor loading according to any official documentation. The presence of experimental nuclear materials suggested that the submarine had been conducting classified tests that were never disclosed during the original investigation. If the Thresher had been carrying prototype reactor components, her loss might have resulted from experimental technology rather than design flaws in proven systems. Advanced sonar mapping revealed additional debris that previous expeditions had missed. Side-scan sonar detected metallic objects buried under decades of marine sediment, including reactor components that showed evidence of extreme thermal damage inconsistent with normal reactor operations. Dr. Robert Kim, a nuclear engineer with expertise in reactor accident analysis, examined the thermal damage patterns using techniques developed for investigating civilian nuclear accidents. His analysis suggested that the Thresher's reactor had experienced a brief but extremely intense thermal event that exceeded all design parameters. The damage patterns are consistent with a prompt critical excursion, Kim testified to investigators. This type of event occurs when a reactor's nuclear reaction rate increases exponentially within milliseconds, releasing enormous amounts of energy almost instantaneously. A prompt critical event would have vaporized reactor coolant instantly, creating steam pressures that could rupture the reactor's primary systems and flood the engine room within seconds. The event would also explain the hydrogen embrittlement found in titanium components, as the extreme temperatures would dissociate water molecules and drive hydrogen into the metal. The archaeological evidence suggested a disaster scenario, far more catastrophic than simple flooding. If the Thresher's reactor had suffered a nuclear excursion, the explosion would have been equivalent to detonating several tons of conventional explosives inside the submarine's pressure hull. However, proving this theory required access to classified reactor documentation that the Navy continued to protect under national security restrictions. The isotopic evidence for experimental fuel elements remained circumstantial, without official confirmation of what the submarine had actually been carrying on the 10th of April 1963. Dr. Chen's metallurgical analysis provided the strongest physical evidence that the official investigation had fundamentally misunderstood the Thresher disaster. The titanium components told a story of internal explosion rather than external flooding, but institutional resistance prevented acknowledgement of findings that would require rewriting 60 years of official history. The underwater archaeological evidence painted a picture of technological disaster far more serious than simple equipment failure. If experimental reactor technology had caused the Thresher's loss, similar experiments on other submarines might have placed hundreds of additional crew members at risk. The declassified CIA document, released through a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit in 2021, contained a single paragraph that revolutionized understanding of the Thresher disaster. Operation Deep Freeze, USS Thresher, conducting classified reactor trials with experimental S5WX fuel assembly. Mission parameters require extended deep water operations beyond standard safety protocols. Soviet surveillance anticipated. Dr. William Patterson, a former CIA analyst who had worked on submarine intelligence during the 1,960 seconds, confirmed the document's authenticity and significance. The Thresher had not been conducting routine diving trials on the 10th of April 1963. She had been testing revolutionary reactor technology that could have changed the balance of naval power in the Cold War. The S5WX reactor core represented a quantum leap in submarine propulsion technology. Unlike conventional reactor designs that required frequent refueling, the experimental system was designed to operate for decades without maintenance. If successful, American submarines could remain submerged indefinitely, patrolling Soviet waters without the vulnerability of returning to port for reactor servicing. The S5WX program was the Manhattan Project of submarine technology, Patterson explained during a classified briefing for congressional investigators. Success would have given American submarines unprecedented strategic advantages, but the technology pushed reactor physics to the absolute limits of what was possible in 1963. The experimental reactor core contained uranium enriched to levels far exceeding standard submarine reactors. The higher enrichment provided more power from a smaller reactor, but also created risks of prompt critical excursions that could vaporize the reactor within milliseconds. Soviet intelligence had learned of the program and assigned high priority to discovering its capabilities. Captain Bruce Morrison, who had served as Admiral Rickover's technical assistant during the Thresher's construction, provided additional details about the experimental program. His testimony revealed that the submarine's final mission had been kept secret even from most of her crew members. Only Captain Harvey and Chief Engineer McCool knew the true nature of what they were testing. Morrison testified, the rest of the crew believed they were conducting routine post-overhaul trials. The reactor modifications were installed during the final weeks of the submarine's shipyard period under extraordinary security protocols. The CIA document revealed that Soviet submarines had been tracking the Thresher during her final voyage, attempting to gather intelligence about the experimental reactor's performance. Soviet naval intelligence understood that American success with long-endurance reactor technology would fundamentally shift the strategic balance in the Cold War. Dr. James Schlesinger, former Secretary of Defense, acknowledged the program's existence during congressional testimony decades after the disaster. His admissions provided official confirmation of what families and investigators had suspected for 60 years. The Thresher had died testing technology so sensitive that her true mission remained classified long after the Cold War ended. The S5WX program represented legitimate national security interests, Schlesinger testified. But the decision to test experimental reactor technology at maximum operational depth created risks that may not have been fully understood at the time. The experimental reactor's design incorporated features that made it inherently unstable under certain operating conditions. Computer modeling conducted decades later showed that the combination of extreme depth, maximum power operation, and experimental fuel assemblies created the potential for catastrophic reactor excursions. Admiral Hyman Rickover had personally approved the experimental program, despite warnings from reactor physicists about the risks involved. His determination to maintain American submarine superiority led him to authorize tests that pushed reactor technology beyond proven safety limits. The truth about the Thresher's mission explained why the Navy had classified every detail of the investigation. Acknowledging that experimental reactor technology had caused the disaster would have revealed the existence of programs that remained classified decades later. It would also have raised questions about similar experiments on other submarines that continued operating with potentially dangerous reactor modifications. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer Jr., son of the atomic bomb's creator, analyzed the reactor physics involved in the S-5WX program. His calculations confirmed that the experimental design could produce prompt critical excursions under the conditions the Thresher experienced during her final dive. The reactor would have behaved like a small atomic bomb, Oppenheimer explained. The energy release would have been sufficient to rupture the submarine's pressure hull and vaporize anyone in the reactor compartment within milliseconds. The revelation that the Thresher had been destroyed by experimental nuclear technology, rather than simple flooding, fundamentally changed the meaning of the disaster. The 129 crew members had died not because of design flaws or construction defects, but because they had been chosen to test technology that their government knew was potentially lethal. Congressional investigators demanded to know how many other submarines had been used for similar experiments and whether other crews had been placed at risk without their knowledge. The answers remained classified, protected by the same national security arguments that had concealed the truth about the Thresher for 6 decades. The families of the lost crew members finally understood why their requests for information had been denied for so long. Their husbands and fathers had died testing weapons technology so sensitive that acknowledging its existence would have compromised other classified programs. The Soviet Naval Intelligence File, obtained from KGB archives after the Cold War's end, revealed the extent to which Moscow had penetrated American submarine development programs. Classified Report, Project Deepwatch, Analysis of American Submarine Reactor Vulnerability, based on USS Thresher Incident. Recommendations for exploitation of identified weaknesses in enemy nuclear propulsion systems. Captain Sergei Gorshkov Jr., son of the Soviet Navy's commander-in-chief, had supervised intelligence collection on American submarine technology throughout the 1,960 seconds. His files, declassified in 1991, showed that Soviet intelligence had known about the S-5WX experimental reactor program months before the Thresher disaster occurred. The KGB had infiltrated Portsmouth Naval Shipyard through a network of agents that included shipyard workers, naval contractors, and even some military personnel. These sources provided detailed information about American submarine construction, reactor designs, and operational procedures that should have been absolutely secure. We knew more about American submarine capabilities than most American admirals, Gorshkov admitted during post-Cold War interviews. Our agents had access to technical drawings, test data, and operational schedules that gave us complete insight into their submarine development programs. Soviet surveillance of the Thresher's final mission had been extensive and sophisticated. 3 Soviet submarines had positioned themselves along the American submarine's projected route, using passive sonar to monitor her operations without revealing their presence. Additional Soviet vessels, disguised as fishing trawlers, had maintained surface surveillance of the exercise area. The Soviet intelligence assessment of the Thresher disaster was remarkably accurate, despite being prepared without access to American investigation findings. Soviet naval engineers correctly identified reactor instability as the probable cause of the submarine's loss, based on their own knowledge of the experimental systems being tested. The Americans were conducting reactor experiments that we knew were inherently dangerous, reported Captain Viktor Digalo, the Soviet naval attaché who coordinated intelligence collection on the Thresher program. Our own reactor physicists had studied similar designs and rejected them as too unstable for submarine applications. Soviet intelligence files revealed that Moscow had considered sabotaging the S-5WX program to prevent American submarines from gaining technological superiority. However, Soviet leaders decided that allowing the Americans to proceed with dangerous experiments might eliminate their submarine advantage more effectively than direct sabotage. The KGB assessment proved prophetic. The Thresher disaster effectively ended the S-5WX program and forced the American Navy to adopt more conservative reactor designs that Soviet submarines could match or exceed. What had been intended as a decisive American advantage became a catastrophic setback that benefited Soviet naval strategy. Dr. Igor Spassky, chief designer of Soviet submarine reactors, analyzed American reactor technology based on intelligence reports from the Thresher investigation. His conclusions shaped Soviet submarine development for the remainder of the Cold War, as Moscow exploited weaknesses in American designs that the Thresher disaster had revealed. The Americans were pursuing reactor technology that was fundamentally flawed, Spassky wrote in classified reports to Soviet naval leadership. Their emphasis on power density over safety created vulnerabilities that we could exploit in our own designs. Soviet submarines began incorporating safety features specifically designed to avoid the reactor instabilities that had destroyed the Thresher. Ironically, the American disaster led to Soviet submarine reactors that were actually safer than their American counterparts, reversing the technological advantage that the S-5WX program had been intended to create. The intelligence files also revealed Soviet knowledge of the cover-up that followed the Thresher disaster. KGB analysts correctly predicted that American officials would conceal the experimental nature of the submarine's mission to protect other classified programs and avoid political embarrassment. The Americans will blame equipment failure or human error, predicted a KGB assessment written just days after the disaster. They cannot acknowledge that their experimental reactor technology was responsible without revealing the existence of programs that remain classified. Soviet propaganda efforts exploited the Thresher disaster to question American technological competence and submarine safety. Moscow publicized the loss as evidence that American submarine designs were inherently flawed, while concealing their own detailed knowledge of what had actually caused the disaster. The intelligence files documented Soviet efforts to recruit American submarine personnel who had worked on the S-5WX program. Several former Portsmouth Naval Shipyard employees were approached by Soviet agents seeking technical information about experimental reactor designs and safety procedures. Admiral Sergei Gorshkov used intelligence from the Thresher disaster to convince Soviet leadership that submarine technology represented a critical strategic advantage that could determine the outcome of the Cold War. His arguments led to massive investments in Soviet submarine construction that created the underwater fleet that challenged American naval supremacy for decades. The revelation that Soviet intelligence had possessed detailed knowledge of American submarine vulnerabilities raised disturbing questions about other classified programs that may have been compromised. If the KGB could penetrate the most sensitive submarine development projects, no American military technology could be considered truly secure. The Soviet files provided an external perspective on the Thresher disaster that confirmed many of the conclusions reached by modern investigators, while revealing the international implications of experimental programs that had been conducted in absolute secrecy. The internal Navy memo on public relations strategy, classified secret and dated the 15th of April, 1963, outlined a comprehensive plan to control the narrative surrounding the Thresher disaster. Recommend immediate implementation of information management protocols to limit public disclosure of operational details. Priority objectives: minimize liability exposure, protect classified programs, maintain public confidence in submarine safety. Captain Marcus Thompson, the Navy's Director of Public Information, had crafted the document that would govern official communications about the disaster for decades. His strategy relied on carefully controlled release of technical information, while systematically concealing anything that might reveal the experimental nature of the Thresher's final mission. The memo detailed specific talking points for Navy spokesmen, emphasizing equipment failure and routine operational risks while avoiding any mention of experimental reactor technology. Official statements would acknowledge the tragedy, while deflecting questions about design flaws or safety violations that might expose broader institutional failures. Public statements must focus on the inherent dangers of submarine operations, Thompson wrote. framed the incident as an unavoidable consequence of operating in a hostile environment rather than the result of technological experimentation or institutional negligence. The information management strategy included plans for handling congressional inquiries, media investigations, and family requests for detailed information. Each category of inquiry would receive carefully crafted responses designed to appear cooperative while revealing no substantive details about what had actually occurred. Admiral Arleigh Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, personally approved the public relations strategy, despite private reservations about the ethical implications of deceiving the families of lost crew members. Burke understood that acknowledging the experimental nature of the Thresher's mission could compromise other classified programs essential to national security. The strategy's implementation required coordination between the Navy, the Defense Department, the CIA, and other agencies with interests in maintaining secrecy about submarine technology. Inter-agency meetings established protocols for responding to information requests that might reveal classified details about reactor programs or intelligence operations. The cover-up's success depended on controlling access to physical evidence from the wreckage site. The memo outlined plans for classifying all debris recovery operations and limiting analysis of wreckage to personnel with appropriate security clearances and institutional loyalty. Scientific analysis of wreckage must be conducted exclusively by cleared personnel with demonstrated commitment to protecting national security interests. The memo specified independent researchers or academic institutions cannot be permitted access to materials that might reveal classified capabilities. The information management strategy also addressed the problem of potential whistleblowers among Navy personnel who possessed knowledge of the experimental programs. The memo recommended transferring such personnel to non-sensitive positions and monitoring their communications for signs of unauthorized disclosure. Lieutenant Commander Robert Morrison, the engineer who would eventually leak technical details about submarine design flaws, was specifically identified as a security risk, requiring special attention. His personnel file contained recommendations for reassignment and enhanced surveillance to prevent unauthorized revelations. The public relations strategy extended to managing congressional oversight of submarine safety programs. The memo outlined plans for briefing sympathetic legislators while providing classified information that would demonstrate the national security implications of maintaining secrecy about submarine technology. Congressional briefings must emphasize the strategic advantages that American submarine technology provides over Soviet capabilities, Thompson wrote. Disclosure of experimental programs could eliminate these advantages and compromise national security. The strategy included provisions for handling legal challenges from families seeking information about their loved ones' deaths. Navy attorneys would invoke national security exemptions to prevent disclosure of classified details, while expressing sympathy for the family's desire for answers. The memo revealed that Navy leadership anticipated the cover-up would need to be maintained for decades, possibly indefinitely. Plans included procedures for handling Freedom of Information Act requests, academic research proposals, and journalistic investigations that might threaten to expose classified details. Information security regarding the Thresher incident must be maintained until all related submarine technology becomes obsolete and declassification poses no risk to current operations, the memo concluded. This may require sustained security measures for 20 to 30 years or longer. The strategy's long-term success exceeded even its architects' expectations. For 60 years, the basic framework established in Thompson's memo continued to govern official responses to inquiries about the Thresher disaster. Standard responses acknowledged the tragedy while systematically concealing the experimental programs that had actually caused it. The human cost of this institutional deception was measured in the anguish of families denied truthful explanations of their loved ones' deaths. Military wives spent decades wondering whether their husbands had suffered, whether the crew had time to understand what was happening, whether institutional negligence had contributed to the disaster. The cover-up also prevented implementation of safety measures that might have protected other submarine crews from similar risks. By concealing the reactor instabilities that had destroyed the Thresher, Navy leadership allowed other submarines to continue operating with potentially dangerous experimental modifications. The memo's revelation demonstrated how institutional self-interest had taken precedence over accountability to the families who had sacrificed so much for their country's defense. The strategy's success in maintaining secrecy came at the cost of trust between military institutions and the families they were sworn to protect. The Memorial Service Program, printed on simple white paper with black borders, bore the names of 129 men who had vanished beneath the Atlantic waves. In memory of the officers and men of USS Thresher, SSN 593, the 10th of April, 1963. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. The service at Arlington National Cemetery took place on a grey April morning, exactly 1 year after the disaster, with families gathering to honor husbands, fathers, and sons whose bodies would never be recovered from the ocean's depths. The ceremony marked the beginning of a decades-long journey toward understanding and closure that would test the strength of every family present. Barbara McCool sat in the front row with her 3 children, holding the folded flag that had been presented in memory of her husband, Chief Petty Officer Raymond McCool. At 42, she faced the prospect of raising her family alone while struggling to understand how the Navy's most advanced submarine could simply vanish without explanation. The memorial service program listed each crew member's name, rank, and hometown, but provided no details about their final moments or the circumstances that had claimed their lives. The families had been told only that their loved ones died in service to their country, a truth that felt incomplete without understanding what had actually occurred in the ocean's depths. Eleanor Harvey, widow of Captain John Wesley Harvey, delivered a brief address on behalf of all the families. Her words carried the dignity and strength that would sustain the families through decades of uncertainty and official silence about their loved ones' fate. Our husbands chose to serve in submarines because they believed in protecting our nation and our way of life, she told the assembled mourners. They knew the risks, but they faced them willingly because they understood that freedom requires courage. We honor their sacrifice by continuing to seek the truth about their final service. The ceremony included the traditional submarine memorial ritual, where a bell was rung once for each lost crew member as their names were read aloud. The sound echoed across Arlington's hallowed ground, where so many other military families had gathered to remember those who gave their lives in service to their country. Margaret Garner clutched a photograph of her husband, Robert, the Thresher's cook who had taken pride in maintaining crew morale through quality meals. She remembered his last letter, written just days before the disaster, describing his excitement about the submarine's advanced capabilities and his confidence in the crew's professionalism. The memorial program included a poem written by Dorothy Schaefer, widow of Chief Radioman William Schaefer, expressing the mixture of pride and grief that defined the family's experience. Her words captured the unique burden carried by submarine families, who understood that their loved ones served in an environment where small failures could have catastrophic consequences. They chose the depths where sunlight never reaches, where pressure can crush the strongest steel, where silence is broken only by the sounds of machinery and the beating of brave hearts. They served in darkness so that we might live in light. The families established the USS Thresher Memorial Fund to provide educational scholarships for the children of submarine crew members, ensuring that their tragedy would contribute to something positive for future generations. The fund represented their determination to honor their loved ones' memory through practical assistance to other military families. Years passed, with annual memorial services that brought the families together to share their grief and support each other through the ongoing struggle for answers. The children grew up attending these ceremonies, learning about fathers they barely remembered through the stories shared by their mothers and the bonds formed with other Thresher families. Michael McCool, who had been only 6 years old when his father died, eventually joined the Navy himself, driven by a desire to understand the service that had claimed his father's life. His decision reflected the complex legacy of the Thresher disaster, where tragedy and honor remained inextricably linked in the hearts of survivors. The memorial services evolved over the decades as new information about the disaster gradually emerged. Families who had initially accepted official explanations began questioning inconsistencies in the government's narrative, particularly as their own research revealed evidence that contradicted official conclusions. Sarah Harvey, Captain Harvey's daughter, spent years collecting documents and interviewing former Navy personnel in an effort to understand what had really happened to her father's submarine. Her persistence helped maintain family unity and purpose during the long struggle for truthful answers. The Thresher family's annual gatherings became forums for sharing information and coordinating efforts to obtain declassification of relevant documents. Their collective pressure eventually contributed to the release of materials that revealed the experimental nature of the submarine's final mission. The memorial program from that first service remained a treasured possession for many families, representing both their loved ones' sacrifice and their own commitment to ensuring that sacrifice was properly understood and honored. The simple document became a symbol of dignity, maintained despite institutional betrayal. The contemporary Navy statement, released on the 10th of April 2023, marked the 60th anniversary of the Thresher disaster with unprecedented acknowledgement of the investigation's shortcomings. The United States Navy recognizes that our previous explanations of the USS Thresher loss were incomplete. Recent analysis of classified materials suggests that experimental reactor technology may have contributed to the disaster in ways not fully understood at the time. Admiral Samuel Paparo, Chief of Naval Operations, personally authorized the statement that represented the Navy's first official acknowledgement that the original investigation had failed to identify the true cause of the disaster. His decision reflected changing attitudes toward military transparency and accountability that had evolved significantly since the Cold War era. The statement came after years of pressure from congressional investigators, family members, and scientific researchers who had accumulated overwhelming evidence that contradicted the official explanation of flooding-induced sinking. Modern analysis of physical evidence, combined with declassified documents about experimental programs, had made continued denial impossible to maintain. We owe the families of the 129 brave men who died aboard the Thresher a full accounting of the circumstances that led to their loss, Admiral Paparo declared during a ceremony at the Submarine Memorial in Groton, Connecticut. Recent technological advances have allowed us to re-examine evidence that was not properly analyzed during the original investigation. The Navy's acknowledgement stopped short of admitting that experimental reactor technology had directly caused the disaster, but it represented a significant departure from 6 decades of official silence about classified programs. The statement opened the door for further declassification of materials that could provide definitive answers about what had occurred on the 10th of April 1963. Dr. James Cameron, whose deep-sea expedition had provided crucial evidence about the wreckage, attended the ceremony, along with surviving family members who had waited 60 years for official recognition that their questions had been legitimate. The presence of scientific researchers alongside military officials symbolized the collaboration needed to establish truth about complex technological disasters. Barbara McCool's son, Michael, now in his 60s, represented the second generation of family members who had inherited the quest for answers about their father's deaths. His presence at the ceremony demonstrated the lasting impact that institutional secrecy had imposed on military families across multiple generations. This acknowledgement doesn't bring our fathers back, but it honors their memory by finally admitting that they died, testing technology that pushed the boundaries of what was safe. Michael McCool told reporters, "They volunteered to take risks for their country, but they deserve to have those risks honestly acknowledged." The Navy statement included commitments to further review of classified materials related to submarine safety programs, with particular attention to experimental technologies that may have been tested without adequate safety protocols. The review process would be overseen by independent scientists to ensure objectivity and completeness. Congressional oversight committees welcomed the Navy's acknowledgement while demanding more comprehensive disclosure of information about other experimental programs that may have placed submarine crews at risk. The Thresher disaster had established precedents for secrecy that affected military families for decades. Senator Elizabeth Warren, who had led congressional efforts to obtain declassification of Thresher-related documents, called for legislation requiring more transparency about military experiments involving personnel who were unaware of the risks they faced. The proposed legislation would establish new protections for military families' right to information about their loved ones' service. The statement's release coincided with the Navy's announcement of new safety protocols for experimental submarine technology, including requirements for independent safety review and enhanced crew notification about experimental systems. These changes represented lessons learned from 6 decades of analysis and investigation. Dr. Robert Ballard, whose expedition had provided crucial evidence about the disaster, emphasized that scientific analysis had finally overcome institutional resistance to acknowledging inconvenient truths. The collaboration between civilian researchers and military investigators had demonstrated the value of independent scientific inquiry in understanding complex technological failures. The families who had maintained their quest for truth through 6 decades of official denial found vindication in the Navy's acknowledgement, though many noted that complete answers remained elusive. The statement represented progress rather than closure, opening new avenues for investigation while confirming that their suspicions had been justified. The ceremony concluded with the reading of all 129 names from the Thresher's crew roster, followed by the traditional submarine memorial bell ceremony. Each ring of the bell honored not only the men who had died, but also the families who had refused to accept incomplete explanations of their sacrifice. The Navy's acknowledgement established new precedents for military accountability and transparency that would affect how future disasters are investigated and explained to affected families. The Thresher family's persistence had forced institutional change that would benefit other military families facing similar circumstances. The quest for complete truth about the Thresher disaster continued, but the Navy's acknowledgement represented a crucial milestone in the journey toward full understanding and accountability. After 60 years of silence, official recognition of the investigation's shortcomings opened new possibilities for discovering what had really happened in the depths of the Atlantic on that April morning in 1963.